Well, welcome. Can you hear me well? Yeah. Welcome to our very first philosophical cafe, Prometheus Problems. I'm really excited that we can finally do this in person. Just a quick intro. My name is Trijsje Fransen. I'm a philosopher at the Philosophy and Ethics Department of TBM, and together with Studium Generale, everyone who's walking around here, we set this up. We thought about naming it Think and Drink, but that is a bit too, we just have apple juice here, so I thought, let's put that as kind of a subtitle. So it's Prometheus Problems, Think and Drink. And next time it should be like in a proper cafe and have a beer and so on, but we'll get there. Very first cafe, I'm very excited. We have 3 speakers. We have our moderator who will do this from now. Interaction is really important, so we'd like to, raise questions and so on. We'll do a poll, and at the end, it's largely discussion. So feel free. Hope you enjoy it. Thanks.
Good afternoon. How are you? Good to see you. Really, I mean it. Finally, to see people in person. That's just amazing. We're very happy to have you. Thank you for joining. And yes, today we are discussing the big question, should an engineer work for the military? My name is Filipos Antoni Desio. I'm a colleague of Trijsje at the section Ethics, Philosophy of Technology here at TU Delft. And today we will be joined by 3 outstanding speakers who are Christine Boshuijzen van Burken, who is joining us all the way from Australia. Good night, Christine. Christine is a senior researcher at the Australian Defence Force Academy, but she's also one of us. She did a PhD at TU Delft and TU Eindhoven in ethics of the military, a decision-making military operation, and she's also a reserve soldier. So she is the perfect profile to discuss this question with us tonight for you, Christine. Welcome. And then we have here in the room the only physical guest of today, Frank Slijper. Frank is the project leader for arm trade at PAX, and he's been working and doing a lot of research in weapon trade and military technology development. Welcome, Frank. And still on Zoom, we have David Abbink, who is a professor here at TU Delft in haptic human-robot interaction. Welcome, David. I think you are there somewhere in the air.
Yes.
We will see you at some point. Hi, David. All right, so before we get to our speakers, I want to ask you, so you have a red and green cardboard on your chair somewhere. So let's get the game started. And I will ask you first of all, and then we'll ask you again at the end, to answer this question. Do you think that an engineer should work for the military? Green is yes, red is not. The vote is open. Okay, interesting. We're going to have a good debate. I think there is a slight majority of green for sure, but some red. Excellent. So let's hear from Christine what she thinks. Christine, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much for this very nice introduction. I do have slides, and I hope I can share them with you. Oh, it says the host has disabled participant screen sharing. So if somebody can give me access, I'll try again. In the meantime, I'd like to give a little bit of a risk that is here. That is either I fall asleep during my own presentation because it's after midnight. I'm joining from Australia. The second risk, I don't know which is worse, is that I have 3 sleeping kids of 1, 3, and 5-year-old in the house, and they may wake up. So I'll try. Yes. I'll share my screen. Do you see my screen? I say slideshow. Do you see all of, just the slide? Good. Okay. First of all, thank you for inviting me, of course. And let's start because we have short time. Should an engineer work for the military? Well, I'll tell you a bit of my personal experience. I worked as an engineer in industry before I did my PhD. And I was here in a computer manufacturing lab. And we as colleagues amongst each other sometimes wondered, this computer chip, we don't know where it will end up. Will it become part of a nuclear missile project? Will it become a pacemaker and save somebody's life one day? We basically don't know, but these were intriguing questions, not just at the bar, but I thought maybe we should think about this a bit more deep. And then I went to my then boss and I said, I want to go and study ethics and philosophy of technology for a year. Can you give me 1 year holiday? And then he said, so you'll go off, you'll study ethics of technology, and then you'll decide you never ever want to work in semiconductor industry because you think all technology is bad. Well, I thought, I don't think so, but let's talk about that later. So this is my personal experience as an engineer, and have been reflecting on technology and especially on military technology because I have a very clear interest in that. So what is going on in the academic debates? Well, there's a very prolific writer on this. His name is John Forge, and he says, no way ever that any engineer or any weapons researcher should go and do research that is about weapons, because it is wrong, it is always wrong, and it will always be wrong. And then there's another very, I think, famous artificial intelligence researcher, Toby Walsh. He's a colleague here in UNSW in Australia. And he was one of the initiators who started a petition in which he asked people, especially researchers in AI, for signing an agreement or a pledge that said we will never participate in nor support the development of lethal autonomous weapons. So you see in which kind of environment we're operating as academics when we're doing a research for the military, those of us. So it's not necessarily welcoming and friendly. And I must say that I have heard more anti than pro weapons research academics. But I will first, before we can even ask these questions, should an engineer work for the military, I think we have to think deeper. We have to ask more questions. We have to probe. The question is, I think, ultimately, should anyone ever work for the military? Like, should we have a military in the first place? Well, and here I'll give you two arguments. One is from a conceptual worldview argument. The other one is an empirical argument. So my worldview, and here it really comes to pre-theoretical assumptions about the world, where you can discuss long about this, but ultimately this is about a conviction. I believe the world is the world. So the world is not heaven, it's not utopia. I'm sorry, it has us in it. And I think so long as there's humans walking around on this planet, there will be people who don't like each other. And yeah, that's a basic conviction about the world and about humans. So this, I'm not the first one who's saying this. There's already, like, of course, in ancient and in other times, people have said, look, the military is maybe necessary, maybe not to solve all our problems. And St. Augustine, yeah, he referred to these two realms that there exist, the realm of earth and then the realm of heaven. And everything we do, like these social, let's call it now in a modern verse, social institutions are there temporarily and they're only relative. So whatever, for example, the military does is not establishing heaven on earth, but it should strive for something that approaches that, but always in a very humble and limited way. And I totally agree with St. Augustine in this. We should strive for justice, and we may use violence for that, but not to establish heaven on earth. So then there's the empirical argument. And here you'll see a list of dictators, maybe. One you probably recognize. There's Hitler, who assassinated an estimate of 6 million Jews. But there's others who are maybe less well known, and I must say the numbers are debatable, but under Mao's regime, there have been maybe up to 70 million people, 70 million people have found death through starvation. I'm just saying, like, this is not necessarily military force, but I'm just saying there's an empirical argument that this world is not always a peaceful place. Even in the absence of weapons, people can do nasty things to each other. And I'm very much appreciative of the former United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan, who really said, okay, how are we going to respond to Rwanda, Srebrenica, where there were gross and systematic violations of human rights that offend every precept of our common humanity. So what are we going to do? Are you just going to look and watch? No, I think for these instances, we need resort to the use of violence. So, second question, should an engineer then work for the military? Well, here we have to think a bit again, because military practice, and this is part of my PhD research, has a qualifying side and a foundational side. What do we mean with that? The qualifying side answers the why question of the military. So why, but not just as a purpose, but really as the destination. What is the value that the military practice embodies? Well, I say it's the promotion of justice, maybe justice and security, if you will. And there is a foundational side to the military practice, and that is the how. How do we promote justice? Well, I think in the military practice, it is in the use of weapons, by the use of weapons. So that's the product of the engineer. It's a technological thing, a weapon, a technical thing, an artifact. But always, 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 always within legal boundaries and mandated by the state. The state has the monopoly on the use of force, and it has delegated this to the army or the police. So there are other means to promote justice. There's diplomatic means, there's courts of justice, etc., etc. But I believe it's very important to keep this clear in the back of your mind. The military has as its core business the promotion of justice, and it does this by using force, lethal force. And here I am quoting a part in a newspaper in Australia here that came on the 14th of April, in which a high military leader said, you military guys, you have to be reminded that your core business is the use of lethal violence. Well, I think that's wrong. Your core business is not the use of violence, so it should go here. That's your core business is the promotion of justice. And how you do that sometimes is by the use of violence. So, in other words, carrying a weapon does not make someone a soldier. Anybody can carry a weapon, doesn't make you a soldier. But a soldier may use her weapon within legal boundaries as a last resort in restoring justice, and therefore engineers that design weapons may be instrumental in the promotion and restoration of justice and security. So, my other very strong argument, I think, relates to this, that military engineers, they create the precondition for all the other engineers that build cathedrals, that build schools, that can work in academia and museums and arts, that we can enjoy all the other goods in society. And I have added, this should not be taken for granted, because living in peace and in just societies does not come for free. So, and the next argument is a little bit of a rhetorical argument. I must say, I'm a philosopher, so I want to make a disclaimer. But I do think that military engineers have created artifacts that are beneficial to wider society. And we're going to learn more about dual use, but oftentimes that's interpreted as civilian technologies that may be used for military purposes. But I think there's a lot of range of artifacts that have been used or developed and used in the military, but that we find very handy nowadays. Think of penicillin, think of Velcro, sunglasses, wristwatches, like you name it, canned food, and we love it. The very fact that we have this conversation now via Zoom is a direct result of military research in DARPA a long time ago, the internet. So yeah, you can have, through your military engineering practices, you can have good military, good civilian spin-offs. So, but then I want to add another statement. I say only the good engineers should work for the military. And now, what is a good engineer? Of course, we know engineers should be accurate, they should be reliable, diligent, industrious, all very good for an engineer. But I want to show you somebody who redefines what it means to be a good engineer. And this is now it's going to be tricky because I want to show a movie, but I'm a bit afraid that you will not have sound. So I'm going to try. If it doesn't going to work, maybe you can watch it later. This is a little, like a few seconds from Schindler's List, a movie that came out in 1993. And we're going to watch a very small part. If you can't hear it, please let me know. Do you hear something?
No, I don't think so.
That was I stopped it. How can I? This is a bit of a shame. I was going to show you a little bit of Schindler's List movie. And what you see here is Schindler in his factory where Stern, which is the person you see here, is a bit worried because the Nazi regime, whom he is making shells and rockets and grenade things for, they are not so happy because they all have failed the quality control tests. And this guy is worried because they said now maybe the whole project is going to fail and they're going to send us back to Auschwitz and we're not going to have any money from the project and our business will stop. And then Oskar Schindler in this movie makes this very, I think, fantastic statement. He says, Stern, if this factory ever produces a shell that can actually be fired, I'll be very unhappy. So he redefines here what it means to be a good engineer. So a good engineer needs to be accurate and reliable and needs to make good things and things that pass quality tests. But if the engineer forgets about the context in which these technologies are being used, and in this it was a poor regime, then he is not such a good engineer. So I will argue that an engineer needs to be all the other things, but he also needs to be he needs to be aware of disqualifying side of the military practice. So he needs to be engineering for justice. So if he's engineering something that does not do this, for example, it cannot discriminate, then maybe he should not proceed that research and that engineering project. The foundational side is important. This is really, you need to make good technology. You need to be accurate, reliable, diligent, and industrious in what you do, but always be aware of the contextual side of the military practice. Like, is this a good cause? And there's numerous examples during the Second World War of engineers that have sabotaged in a very sophisticated way many projects, engineering projects along the Atlantic Wall. And you can go and learn about that more. So, my conclusion, should an engineer work for the military, is yes, because the world needs some form of legally bound organized use of force to uphold justice. Why should engineers work for the military? Well, because they have a role to play in creating and maintaining a just and safe space where all the other engineering practices can take place, like they create a safe place for all the other engineers. And which engineers should work for the military? Well, these are the virtuous, responsible, and critical engineers. And they need to advance the military practice from within. And also through that, they can serve wider society. So thank you very much.
Thank you
I
very
will
much,
stop
Christina.
sharing and I'll give it back to Filippo.
Applause, since for once we are in a physical place. Let's do a real applause. Thank you very much, Christina. And I'm curious to hear what Frank thinks about this. But before that, I would also like to take at least one quick question from the audience. Is there anybody who really has a strong, immediate question? Yes, please. I can eventually translate. So I don't know if you heard the question, Christina. We'll quickly repeat it also for the camera. So the gentleman was saying that maybe the question is whether it was the presence of the military that also, and the paramilitary, that allowed dictators like Hitler to get to the power in the first place. And so maybe it's kind of reversing the question. The military can also be the cause of injustice.
I could not, like, can you repeat the last sentence again? The
So-
military, and then I got lost.
Can also be the source of injustice and the creation of dictatorships, etc.
Yes, exactly. I think you are totally right. Therefore, it's always important and this is the hard part, because we cannot foresee the future. We cannot know everything. But I think to remain critical and to be able, like now, like back then, we needed to bomb half Rotterdam to get a military effect. Nowadays, we can, through military advantage and engineering advances, we can have precision bombings. We don't need to bomb half cities anymore. So I believe that in itself is a win, and that is thanks to engineers. But the whole question of when it is justified to invade a country, these are questions I think don't belong necessarily in the military realm. They should be moved to the realm of into politics.
All right, so there will be, thank you very much for your question. There will be much more time later for more questions, but now I'm curious to hear from Frank, who has a different perspective coming from a research and NGO background. So I'm curious to hear your perspective, Frank. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Do you hear me well? Thanks indeed for inviting me here and for being here live, which is indeed an unusual pleasure, I must say, in these weird times. And I'm very happy to be out of my home for the second time in about 8 months, I think. And so even just for that, this is already a very successful event for myself. And of course, I hope for you as students that sooner rather than later you can return to more normal studying circumstances as well. Maybe very briefly introducing my organization, PAX. For those of you who don't know PAX, it is the largest peace organization in the Netherlands, and I have some 120 colleagues with whom we work in conflict areas, 15 countries around the world where we work with partners from Kosovo and Syria to South Sudan and Colombia, to name a few. And besides, we work a lot on issues related to weapons, weapon technology, working towards regulation of, or even prohibitions of certain weapons, such as nuclear weapons, armed drones, or autonomous weapons. And within PAX, I work on the arms trade. So maybe a brief personal story as related, I think, to the central question of today: should an engineer work for the military? I'm myself clearly not an engineer, I'm an economist, but I faced a rather similar question when I was nearly ending my studies, when I was writing my master thesis on Dutch military industrial policies, because at that time, 1993, there still was compulsory military service in the Netherlands, and I had some extension from going to the military because of university, but after I'd finished it, I was supposed to join the army. And so I had to ask myself the question, what will I do? Long story short, I clearly didn't want to learn how to kill or to be told to kill other people. And also I didn't want to do the alternative service, which was a possibility, but I did not want to submit myself to the required procedure where a commission would interview me and assess whether my objections were valid enough. So I became what was called a total objector, a totaalweigeraar. And since I wasn't looking forward to going to jail for half a year, I had to make sure for the next 5 years that the military police would not catch and arrest me. But in the meantime, I continued working on courses related to reducing the arms trade. I went volunteering in a refugee camp in former Yugoslavia, and I considered that to be my own chosen services to society. And so how does that relate to the question here? As there is no compulsory military service anymore, and you as future engineers are free to choose the direction of your career. Very simple, I think, as a lot of the technologies you study on and you may work on in the future have military relevance. And so it may be in your future job, and sometimes very clearly and directly, and in other cases maybe not so. And whether it is aerospace technology or research into new materials, whether it's robotics or shipbuilding technology, these are all relevant areas that have military relevance. And it's especially the case for technical universities that both the armed forces and companies working on military products have a strong interest to tap into the brain power of a new generation of engineers. And so whether it is, in the case of the Netherlands, Fokker, Thales Nederland, or Damen Shipyards, the 3 largest Dutch arms producing companies, they all are potentially interested in your skills and have collaborations or have had collaborations with Delft University. For these companies and for the military, it may be rather straightforward for you to answer whether you believe it is good or problematic to work for them, partly depending, of course, on how you look at the military and the production of military equipment. In other cases, it may be less clear, as differences between innovations for civilian or military purposes may be blurry, as emerging technologies are often dual use. Think, for example, of areas of robotics and artificial intelligence. And therefore, I believe it's extra important for universities, in the first place, to raise questions about their role and responsibility regarding the potential lethal end uses of their research collaborations. In some cases, the ultimate end use of technologies may not be known in advance, and therefore I think universities should have a clear policy, an ethical policy outlining what is acceptable for them and what not. And I would be interested to hear actually whether here in Delft there are such policies. But of course, students themselves should also be well aware of how their work could contribute to potentially lethal technology. So I would say you should consider asking yourself some questions. Do you know how your skills will be used in the technology you will help developing? Do you agree? Is there discussion possible about this? And of course, will your concerns be heard? Last year, we published some work focusing on questions from the perspective of the development of lethal autonomous weapons and how universities and students should develop a policy to prevent such unwanted developments, in line also with calls, as Christine referred to, by AI professors such as Toby Walsh from the AI and robotics community, who urge to ban lethal applications of artificial intelligence. So concluding, I think it's only good to think about such relevant issues of how you relate to technology and to the military uses of that technology, and to discuss these issues more. Eventually, of course, the choice is yours. And paradoxically, in my case, I think the good thing about the military service was that I had to think about this and to decide whether I would join the military. And it turned out that exactly because of that, 28 years later, I'm still working on issues related to war and peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank, for this insightful presentation. And before we go to David, who I already see on the screen ready to jump in as the in-house Delft engineer, before that, I would like to hear if there is any question now for Frank Slijper. Anyone? We also have a community attending online, so if there is any question also coming from there, just let me know, Lester. All right then, so I guess we can just go on with the next presentation by David Abbink. Professor Abbink, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So there we go. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Yeah? All right. So I will throw the knuppel in het hoenderhok straight away, as we say in Dutch. And so my talk will be about keeping humans in the loop of technology. But actually, I thought, let's take a stance. And I will try to argue why I think that you as an engineer should not dedicate your talent directly to the military. So my name is David Abbink. I'm a professor leading the human-robot interaction group at the Cognitive Robotics Department in Delft. So these are the wonderful colleagues that I work with. And our joint vision is that we want to work on something called human-robot symbiosis. So that means that we're interested in how to make sure that humans understand what robots can and will do, and likewise that robots have some idea of what humans can and will do and want to do. And how do we engineer and design good control, interaction, cooperation, so that together humans and robots can actually do more than either of them by themselves. So that's a very, you could say, human-centered look on automation. And since this technology is also used in military, I want to clarify a couple of things and then go into my argumentation of why I think you should not dedicate your talents to the military. So first of all, it's really important to understand that autonomy is not the end goal for robots. So many people have this idea that we have this kind of linear or exponential increase towards full robot autonomy, and then we're done, as if we have some kind of artificial human then that can do the dirty work for us. But so as a kind of metaphor, I will give this example of Baron Rothschild, who tried to train zebras because everybody in London at that time had horses, and it was so, for the common folk. So he wanted to have zebras. Yeah, and you might think, why am I talking about zebras? So this is the only picture that you have of this situation. And as you can see, the zebras are not walking because they have no intention whatsoever to be trained by humans. So yes, these are similar to painted horses in a way, right? So they look like horses, just a different color. They're autonomous, all right, but they're very independent. Yeah, and that means they're just somehow they operate differently. And so this is a horse, which has a different color, and it seems the same, but actually these do allow cooperation and interdependence instead of independence. So my point is, whenever we think about autonomous systems, I hate the word autonomy because I think very, very, very few systems are truly autonomous that we engineer. And they are always embedded in context, and they should actually allow good cooperation. So one simple example of what I work on is in the automotive industry. We all know the examples, which we call self-driving cars. They're not really self-driving. They actually are kind of self-driving. And one of the things we try to do is use forces on the steering wheel and on the gas pedal to actually communicate straight away what the car thinks is wise to do. So in this case, you know, if this car wants to take a curve, you would feel on the steering wheel smooth forces, not warnings, vibration, but smooth forces through which you can actually engage your whole neuromuscular system, your reflexes, thereby working together, making sure that if there's conflicts, you know that the car wants to do something else, and the car knows that you want to do something else, and then you can actually measure that and work that out. So a lot of the work that I've been doing is trying to understand in this case how from such cooperation actually additional safety or additional benefits emerge. Rather, yeah, that's more than either the human could do or the automated system can do. So this kind of dichotomy: who's better? Is it the automated system? Is it the human? I don't like those kind of discussions, because actually, when you design the cooperation well, it's better than either of them. So one thing that lies central to my view of engineering is this quote from a colleague of mine, John Flack, and he says, "No matter how carefully designed, all automated control systems will eventually face situations that were not anticipated at the time of their design," which I think is very true, also for military technology. And why is that so difficult? It's actually because human behavior is so difficult. And so users of the technology adapt. When they have the technology, they behave differently than if they wouldn't have the technology. Bystanders adapt. There's a collective impact on a larger system. And so that means quite often, you know, engineers make stuff, and then afterwards, Captain Hindsight to the rescue knows exactly what went wrong in a post-analysis, and they said we should have done it differently. Yeah? But actually doing that a priori is extremely difficult. Still, that's something that I find fascinating. And so part of my work tries to go from this single human, single robot interaction to the questions where actually we put the boundary box around the human, or in this case about the connected system of human and robot. But this is what most people ask me when I go to parties, and this is also a topic here: how do we as society stay in control of AI and robotics, for example, in the military domain? Yeah, and that's actually human-robot interaction in the most complex system that we can think of, because you know, it's very splintered. If I go to other conferences and I talk about algorithms rather than robotics, so when it doesn't have a body, and we don't talk to each other. And if you look one level higher, then we actually talk about communities and multi-robots or multi-agent interaction, completely different field. And further, we talk about society, we talk about politics, sociology, and swarms and networks. And as you can imagine, all these things are interrelated and interconnected. And you very quickly go to stutter when you try to understand the sheer complexity of all of this. And so what should you do as an engineer? Yeah, it's extremely difficult to predict. But that's something that I want to work on. And when I looked at the roots of who started to think about this earlier on, I came to a guy called Norbert Wiener, who started, he was a mathematician, kind of wonder boy. Got his PhD at, I don't know, 12 or 14 or something like that, something ridiculous. Actually, he wrote a book called Cybernetics on control and communication in the animal and machine. And it was very influential in my particular control theoretic domain. My conferences are called cybernetics, and actually I never knew what it really was about. And when I started to dig into this, what they were thinking, this was actually a picture of all the thinkers. It was to discuss circular causal and feedback mechanisms, both in biological and in social systems. So they started to actually think about how can we think about what happens in, you know, at the level of biology, at the level of human behavior, but also at social systems. And so these were people who sat at the same table with another hero of mine, Gregory Bateson, an anthropologist that I knew from a kind of one-year stint of philosophy when I was studying that in Amsterdam, when I was bored with engineering. And so these people sat together at the same table, you know, and these were not these were philosophers, biologists, neuroscientists, psychologists, sociologists, psychiatrists, you name it. They were starting to think about how actually feedback and interaction works through from indeed the cell level to society, which I find very inspiring. And some of this thinking just needs to come back to cross this kind of splintered discipline thinking of, well, you know, this is the part that I do, and you know, the rest is for somebody else, which is typically what most engineers and actually what most scientists, most people think. You know, I'm just responsible for this part, and you know, I can't do everything. So somebody else is responsible for that part, for something else. So I'd like to challenge that, at least see where we end up. Yeah. Okay, break. So that is part of my scientific fascination. And now why I think that in all of this complexity and all the work that I'm trying to do, why I don't take money from the military and why I think you shouldn't do either. So let's see, at least it might spark some debate. So, okay, military research is controversial. On one hand, the realist says, you know, if you want peace, you better prepare for war. Because the strongest deterrent is if you're really strong, you know, then nobody will attack you. That's the idea about defense. And on the other side, we have the naive idealist who says, you know, it's peace and love and we shouldn't kill and let's go for utopia. But so a consequence of this idea of civis pacem para bellum is for the realist is to say, well, you know, then we need to spend money. And so you have also these kind of accounts are a bit controversial, but so you know, for example, United States has a very large military budget for many decades. And you, yeah, so some naive idealists like Bill Hicks, a comedian I really like very much, there's other people who think like this, say, well, you could also use that money for something else, or at least part of it, you know, and so what prevents us from doing that? Actually, and is this military spending and all the engineering really giving us the peace and the protection that we think it does? Yeah, and then it's really complicated, and you actually don't know and who's responsible. And so some analogies I would say for me would be like global warming, or should you eat meat or not? And then also, you know, it's controversial. You know, people say, oh, what's my part and what's other people's part? And so some people say, well, the individual is responsible and needs to change. And so the beter milieu begint by jezelf, we have in Dutch. And so actually a good environment starts with you. And so it's your choices that actually determine. And maybe you can't change everything, but at least you can take the choice not to contribute. Yeah, and other people say, well, that's ridiculous. You know, it's the system that's responsible and that needs to change. One individual can't make that change. And it sounds nice, you know, and it's very idealistic. But actually, you know, een beter milieu begint niet bij jezelf. It's actually, you know, politics that should change. So where does it leave us as an individual engineer? And so our examples actually of good engineers, like Archimedes or Da Vinci, you know, they have a strong history of dual use. So, you know, they were thinkers, philosophers, and they did both. So is that an example we should follow? I'm not sure. But one thing that is, I think, the basis for my conviction is that there's something wrong with engineering too much military power. And so here we have the Battle of Alesia at the left, where Caesar made this big victory on the Gauls and slaughtered I don't know how many Gauls, where actually engineers really contributed to making that possible. You think of all the engineering and economic and military power that Britain had. And so you see here the 22 countries in the world that did not face a British invasion. So that had nothing to do with defense. Yeah, and these are the kind of t-shirts that you see walking around by the idealist hippies. And this is the Democracy World Tour. So every country invaded by United States. And so what does this have to do with defense? Yeah, so sometimes defense facilitates offense. And so we think about the weapons of mass destruction, you know, cause of war, that also the Netherlands went along with, yeah, which was, yeah, well, they were not there simply, right? The basis for going to war to Europe was extremely thin.
Sorry, Dad, we just have an announcement. Hold on a second.
Okay. All right. So you know, who determines how technology and how the military is actually put to use? So if there's a good government, yeah, the military and a good military, that's all good. But so what if the government uses the military for things that perhaps should not be used for? And if you would like to know a bit more, this is a book that I really kind of opened my eyes to just a part of the world. But this book by Robert Fisk, I can really recommend. And so in this search for, weapons of mass destruction, a new one is lethal autonomous weapon systems, right? And they're proposed as a way, the same argument that we heard a little bit earlier, as a way to have kind of surgical strikes, yeah, to add much more precision. But actually, when you look what happens, really a lot of civilians are being killed. And so this is an example: 41 men targeted so far, that particular point in time, but actually, over 1,000 people killed. So is that really the surgical strike, and who actually takes responsibility for that? So some people say, well, we don't know where it will end, and so we should, ban anything that goes towards more autonomous robots. So let's ban killer robots. But then, already, in 1192, Pope Innocentius banned crossbows, and we all know how that went. And so actually, when technology can proliferate, banning is simply not the best of solutions. And so what else can we do? And so there's production, proliferation, deployment, use of such technology. What can you do? And one of the things that we can try to do as engineers is make sure that when we produce and develop our systems, is that we consider this concept of meaningful human control, which is something that Filippo is famous for, I would say. And so I won't go to too much detail. If you want to know more something about the military side of this, I can really recommend this book. But there's also at Delft an interfacultary effort to actually try and think about meaningful human control over any kinds of autonomous systems. And none of us take, at least, money from the military, because we want to actually develop this open science and available to everybody. How we can actually think about who stays in control and who takes responsibility, also moral responsibility. So in the end, what do you do as an individual engineer? And so I quote a writer in The Guardian, who says, as engineers, we actually must consider the ethical implications of the work. And he says, actually, our profession seems to have preserved the sense that technology is almost by necessity a force of good. Yeah, we are focused on the technical and managerial sides of technology, how to design algorithms, how to build machines, but not so much on the context of its deployments, and not its unintended consequences. We're not very interested in politics and social dynamics. And I think as engineers, it will be a bright day for our profession when we start producing more engineers who will have the will and the intellectual capacity to engage with such bigger questions about the ethics, politics, and social ramifications of their engineered inventions. And one of them is, who do we actually work for? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. I mean, I'm impressed. So many philosophical talks today from all the sides. I'm very happy to hear that. Well done, Traishi, with the organization too. All right, any question for David? There will be a break soon, but I would also like to engage the audience a bit in a conversation before we go for a break. So is there any question for David or for any of the other speakers before we go for a break? Yes, please. David, can you give an example of meaningful human control?
Yes. So there's two answers to that. One is to explain a bit more what meaningful human control is, and one is an example of a system that is under meaningful human control and how you could design that. So first of all, meaningful human control actually deals with responsibility, and so that means that actually to juxtapose two types of systems that I think are almost the same, but do something very different about being under control, yes or no, is systems that, for example, in driving, like for example, systems that are on the market right now that allow you to keep your hands off the steering wheel, making sure that you are actually as a driver still able to take over control, but kind of luring you into a situation where you may not have control. Simply put, you actually start to do something else. You start to drift off. And then we still say, but you're responsible. So then, you know, kind of, it's a bit tricky who's actually really responsible. And if you take, for example, this approach where you say, no, we actually need to keep drivers in the loop straight away, and we support the driver not to get out of this loop by, you know, allowing you to take your eyes off the road and the hands on the wheel. But then if something goes wrong, still get you back into the loop. They would be more under what I would call meaningful human control. Now, in the terms of autonomous weapon systems, actually the point was slightly more extreme, I would say. And that's to say, if a system would be allowed, for example, a weapon system would be allowed to make decisions on its own and respond so quickly that no single operator would be able to prevent it or understand what it will do and be able to actually overrule or change it, then that system would not be under meaningful human control. But so there's actually a whole books written about it. But I hope this sheds some light on some practical tips what it might be or what it might not be.
Thank you, David. Any other questions for David, Frank, or Christina too? I don't know. Christina, are you still there?
Yes, I am. I'm here.
That's good. I was checking if you fell asleep in the meanwhile.
Not yet.
But thank you for hanging in. Any other questions for Christine, David, or Frank before we go? Are you convinced? Yes, please. Yeah. So I just repeat. The gentleman asked Christine. You say that it's okay to work as an engineer for the military if they are the right people, the good guys, but how do you know in advance that you're actually working for the good guys?
Yes, this is a very good question, and this is part of the things that are unknown. But I believe you need to do what Schindler did, have your eyes wide open. Look further than just what the media tells you, look at patterns, look at what is actually going on. And of course, you can't look into the future. The government can tell you things that may not be the whole truth, but I really do your own, put on your critical glasses all the time. Do your research yourself as well. And of course, you can't know. I'm just a simple civilian. I don't know everything. But yeah, keep your eyes wide open.
Which takes us also to a point that Frank made, that we need to be critical and keep our eyes open. But how do we do that? As engineers, as citizens, do we really have the capacity and the power to really be sufficiently informed and able to make a critical, well-informed decisions about these matters? And wouldn't it be just better to take a more radical approach like David's and say, since we cannot know, we better just not go there? Frank?
I think at least you have that possibility. And I mean, maybe one example that you've heard of is the example of Google and their involvement in Project Maven, which was initially set up as a means to smoothen all the hours of video material coming out of drones. And at some point, a number of people working at colleagues and involved in that Project Maven started having concerns about this work. And it turned out that, I mean, simply because I think most people who started working for Google had never imagined that they would end up working for the Pentagon. And so a discussion started, but a discussion that was not really appreciated in the beginning by the executives. And only after it really became a controversy and a number of people left their job and it became headline news, Google really started worrying, I think, also about their consumer base, about their reputation, and they started setting up a policy in which they said that their work would never be involved in lethal applications. They didn't say they would never work with the military again, but projects such as Project Maven would be off limits in the future. So I think that is what is caused by, and you can replace the employees of Google by students here at the university or in any other circumstances where you as a student or an employee suddenly discover that you work on a project that doesn't feel good to you.
Any further questions? Yes, please. Yeah, so that's a question for all the panelists, and the question is, how much power do actually engineers have in political decision making in these matters? Is this enough? They should have more, less? So maybe let's start from David this time. David, then Christine, then Frank.
Thanks. Yes. So again, for me, two answers. How much powers do individual engineers have? Maybe not much. Similar to being a vegetarian or vegan or not having a car because you were worried about global warming. You could at least have the stance, I don't want to contribute to certain things. So that power you do have. Yeah. And second, I think engineers are typically not very well represented in politics. So we have as engineers an odd relationship to authority, I think. Yeah, we typically don't take it. We follow it. And in politics, it's usually alphas and gammas who actually determine policies, right? So one thing is, I'm not quite sure if engineers themselves should have more responsibility, but I think they should definitely be better represented, and they should definitely be better educated, more broadly educated. That's what I think is very important to actually, what I think the other panelists say as well, open your eyes, be critical. That actually takes time. It takes reading. It takes time outside. It takes these kind of events too, which I think is a very good initiative. So, and then maybe we can take more authority as well in these debates.
Christina, what should be the political role of engineers?
Well, I strongly believe that there should be a separation in societal sphere. Church, state, hospitals, universities, they have their own independence and they have their own unique responsibility towards wider society. But I believe what the role of the engineer could be is to educate the politicians, like the engineers, especially when it comes to artificial intelligence and autonomous systems. I am under the impression that many politicians have not really a good idea of what is going on, what are the limitations, what has already been developed actually, and I believe we can have a role in educating politicians, but I believe the role of the politician is to bring everything together, like look at the international perspective, look at the power dynamics, look at how like public justice can be served through what the engineer has told you. So yeah, I believe there's an educational side from, like, it's two ways. Engineers should maybe be engaged more what's happening on the political level, but the other way around as well. Politicians should really invest in understanding these technologies a bit better. They don't have to be experts. Maybe we are as philosophers, as engineers, but we can at least start discussions.
Thank you. Frank?
Yeah, I think since it's been mentioned a couple of times, especially in the area, the discussion on lethal autonomous weapons, you see that there is a lot of input also on a political level by the scientific community. For example, people who attend expert meetings in Geneva where the UN is discussing these issues with states and have hearings, sessions where executives from Google DeepMind, where professors, artificial intelligence, Stuart Russell, Toby Walsh, have done presentations, and I think that is not only important for the discussion because people like us are more easily put away as peaceniks or naive, but they have not only the authority but the knowledge that admittedly I don't have on the very technical level, and I think they will remain involved. But it's good that they would even step up their commitment to these discussions, because eventually I believe if you talk also referring to what was said on is it about you changing something or taking a position, or is it about the system that has to change? I think it goes both ways really, and especially in the context of arms races or disarmament processes, I think there needs to be regulations or prohibitions, whatever, on an international level, but that should be fed by including by engineers.
Thank you. So I think it's time to take a short break, even though I understand that we cannot move around. So the break will consist in just taking some rest and moving to the bar, so to speak. And after the break, there will be more questions for you. I will ask the panelists to engage in questions between each other. So I will ask Christina to ask a question to David to Frank, and Frank to Christina. So be prepared. And then we can also talk more a bit about the lethal autonomous weapon systems debate. But more questions for you, so get prepared with more questions. We reconvene in 5 minutes. All right, 5 minutes. Welcome back to the second part of this session on the question, should an engineer work for the military? We have more time for some questions from the audience. So first of all, I would like to hear if there is anybody who has a question for one of all of our panelists. Yes, please. Sorry, I missed the last part. If? All right. All right, yeah. Okay, got it. So, Christine, a question for you is, why is it important that engineers do good? Isn't it enough that there are legal boundaries to what they do? So that's a question, is the legal boundaries enough?
Yes, thank you for the question. This is an important question. I believe, first and foremost, you need to do what is legally right. But there are instances in which there is a conflict between what the law requires you to do and what is the right thing to do. A very simple example, the law says you need to stop for a red traffic light, but if you have a dying child in your car, I think you're doing the morally right thing to disobey the law and rush to the hospital. So I believe in, especially now that we are moving more and more towards autonomous systems, the law may not be sufficient anymore. And we need to think much, much more about ethics, like what is the right thing to do? We have to think about context. We have to think about, is this the right weapon system in this circumstance? I may be legally right, but maybe at the end of the day, I don't want to be responsible for what this machine thing is going to do. So I believe we need to be extra careful in terms of ethics.
I think that's an excellent question. I would like to hear also what the other panelists believe about the relationship between ethics and the law in relation to your choices as an engineer in relation to the military. David or Frank, do you have a strong opinion on this? Is law sufficient? Should we work for better law? Should we also work for better ethical education?
Shall I?
Yeah.
I think the law is mostly indeed a minimum norm and not a guidance of what you have to do. And I think that it was mentioned earlier, if you see the development of, for example, missile systems or bombs, where in the Second World War we had these dumb bombs that were just dropped, and we call what we now have precision-guided munitions. But you could ask yourself the question, has anything really changed? If you look at the end result, if you look at aerial pictures of Raqqa in Syria or Mosul in Syria, where Western and Arab forces with their highly sophisticated fighter jets and precision-guided munitions have projected so much force that in the end the result is not that much different, and there may have been more and better attempts to spare the civilian population, but still casualties have been very much underrated, underreported, and the damage is still huge. So they may not have committed violations of international humanitarian law, but still it's, I think, very questionable whether the damage justifies the goal, the aim of the mission there.
And from an engineering perspective, David, from a research perspective, you say already something about the importance of ethics, but I think it's a fair question to say, shouldn't you just stick to the law? And wouldn't that be already a good starting point to avoid societal problems?
Yeah, so I would say that especially when technology and society changes and develops as quickly as it does, I think the law lags. So yes, stay within the law unless it's necessary, like Christina said. Of course, it's a good starting point, but I would very much agree that in most cases, probably you need to also take a stance yourself. which goes beyond just obeying the law. At least, yeah, I think. So I think the main point is being critical, right? Is trying to be critical, and when we that's something that has not so much space in engineering education. So the ability to reflect on whether the laws are sufficient or not, I think is very important. So in that case, I would say no, the law by itself is not necessarily always and everywhere enough.
Okay, thank you. So during the break, Christina, did you have the time to think of a question for David? Would you like to try and convince him that he should eventually come and work for an institution, for a military institution like yours? Do you have a question for him?
Yes, I have a question. So you threw the knuppel in het hoenderhok, and I'm going to ask you to take up the handschoen on
Nice.
this one. So you say no way there is that this robot-human interactions can ever be meaningfully applied or should be applied in the military domain. My question is, do you think this kind of research that you're doing, human-machine symbiosis, should be or can be used in the law enforcement domain? So we're talking about police, and if so, why? And if not, why not?
Great question, and actually, so maybe I was not clear, but my point is not that the technology I develop can never be used by the military. My point was that I never take funding from defense, and so of course I work in so all the technology I develop for the automotive industry. It's very easy to translate that to military aircraft or military patrols or law enforcement, like you say. So in that sense, I'm not claiming that my hands are completely clean and nothing I do will ever go towards use of force. I don't think that that's necessarily the case. I guess I just draw the line at really taking money to dedicate my time and energy and talents specifically to military applications. If not for anything, the fact that it needs to stay clandestine often. But I think also from just that's my moral line in the sand, I guess. And there's no such thing as an absolute right or wrong in this. I think it is personal. Yeah. Does that answer your question, or
Yes, certainly. And I think it comes back to one of my first slides, that there is at a certain point these are these pre-theoretical assumptions that we make, these choices that we make that we cannot argue anymore, not theoretically, not empirically, but these are just our deep convictions.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Thank you for clarifying them. Thank you.
Yeah.
David, did you have the time to come up with a question for Frank, maybe about his experience in the NGOs or whatever he said in his presentation?
Yeah, I actually have a couple for Frank. So I'm thinking which one. So maybe I'll ask two in a sneaky way. My question to you, Frank, would be: you have much experience with the real complex situations of, I think, war-infected regions. And all the complexities, that went into the history and what's actually happening and finding out what's actually happening. And my question to you is, what motivated you to actually dedicate your time and talents to be there? And so you mentioned something about that, but what is it in you that drives you to be there? Because it takes sacrifices too, I think. And because not all of us do that and are willing to do that, what actually can you take away from that for the people who don't have, the drive to go where you went, and that might help us to be better aware of what's happening.
Ooh.
Good luck.
Good luck. Yeah, it's 2 in 1.
Yeah. I mean, I could give multiple answers as well. One is when I started studying economics, I thought of becoming a businessman, a manager for a big Japanese company, because at that time Japan was the emerging economy, and that was what my vision of my near future was. And quite soon, actually, already in my first year, what's the English? Had a cold turkey. I really discovered that this was not what I wanted. Somehow I struggled continuing, and only in my last year I got, when I was thinking about, next year, military service, etc., there was this question coming from a small NGO at the time to do this research into Dutch military industrial policies. And for the first time at that time I could study 6 years. For the first time in 6 years I had that idea. Oh wow, this is interesting. This is something what triggers me and sparks interest. And so that combination of the two was important. And maybe on a more personal thing, and that's probably not maybe relevant to some other people as well. I mean, my parents had experienced the Second World War, my mother in Indonesia, my father in Rotterdam. So from very close, they had experienced war. And even though we talked very little about it at home, it was clear that it had a huge impact on them. And so I think merely feeling that, also, again, in that context of thinking about my own future and joining the military or not, this was something that I think I didn't realize it so much at that time, but I think later on I started realizing that was also something, how do you call it, intrinsically motivating me as well in the end. And finally, also what I saw while working in Yugoslavia during the war there, literally brings war quite close, and also I think was an important driver for me to dedicate my work, my career to the kind of work I'm doing now.
Thank you. And do you have a question for Christina?
Very practical question, Christina, maybe. Suppose, I mean, I'm not even sure it's still working, but until a couple of years ago, Delft University was sending students for internships to Lockheed Martin in the US, working on the F-35, the Joint Strike Fighter. Realizing that on the one hand, this is of course, as I can imagine as an engineer, a superb piece of technology, high-tech, stealthy, etc. Would it matter to you if at the same time you know that this aircraft will be used to bomb towns and cities wherever in the world, not only by Dutch or US air forces, but maybe also by other air forces buying that aircraft, be it Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates or Israel or Egypt or Taiwan in the future maybe? Would that be a reason for you not to go to Lockheed Martin for your internship?
So yeah, I think it's a very clear question, very practical question. No, it would not. That would not make a difference to me. I would still believe that we're dealing with a company that has. I'm not too sure. I don't have my eyes wide open in this, but with a decent company that has at least legal standards and knows how to. You're doing you know more, definitely more about this. But I would not stop buying a weapon that good governments can use for good causes, while via the back door it may be used for bad causes. That's very practical. I would certainly not hold me back, and maybe I can have a little bit in my small role as an intern. Maybe I can have a little bit of room to ask critical questions if it's really a wise idea to sell this weapon to countries like Saudi Arabia. Who knows?
Yep.
Thank you. I think there's one more question from a gentleman in the back. Yeah. 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 Is your question directed to anybody in particular, or shall we just hear? Yeah. So the question is, was it basically how do we define what is good? So everybody in the room say we should be good engineer, or the weapons should be used for good purposes, etc. But of course, we know that it's a very controversial thing, and different countries, different cultures have different conceptions of good. So how can we make any use of the concept of goodness?
Well, good question. We've been thinking about this maybe over 2,000 years, and we still haven't agreed upon something. So I'm thinking maybe Filippo, do you have something to say about
I'm just a moderator here.
That's not
Well,
good.
That was a good question. What, like, I believe there's like some intuitive, like, there's a lot of intuitive understanding about what good is. Like, what is a good moderator? What is a good question? So I believe good causes are related to this idea of restoration of justice, and it's not to go fuel a war economy, not about things that are somewhere in the earth, although they can be used as there can be like a hidden agendas. Of course, there can be hidden agendas, but I believe it's up to the international community to keep all our other countries that are involved in going to wars to call them on and ask them for like accountability, responsibility for what they have done. So you can have it up front, like explain me why you need to go to war. Is this really for the restoration of justice? Think about Kofi Annan's statement. Do we really have to watch what's going on here and keep our hands in our pockets and don't do anything? Is that a good thing? I don't think it's the case. I think sometimes we just have to act with lethal force, and sometimes we should not have acted with lethal force, and that can be in retrospect as well.
I think the question can also be posed to in relation to what you were saying, Frank. You were sort of implying that certain governments would use the weapons in a way that you would consider as bad or not. So what you had in mind? You had in mind some sort of a more international law framework or something more substantive in terms of the badness of the use of these weapons?
Yeah, both actually. I mean, with a lot of international organizations, we're working at the moment with states on what is called a political declaration on the use of explosive weapons, meaning that we recognize that merely referring to international law is not sufficient, because all Western states at least will always say that they stick to international regulations. And since we feel this is not sufficient, we've worked with states together to get to not a ban on the use of missiles, but a stricter use of it, acknowledging simply that what we've seen, at least since the use of precision-guided munitions in the Gulf War in 1991, the level of harm has not been reduced. So steps need to be taken.
Are there more questions for our panelists? Yes, please. Yeah. So I don't know if you heard a question very briefly. You mentioned the two extreme position of the realist and the idealist or utopian thinker, but couldn't you think of sort of striking a balance and finding a good mix and compromise between these two positions? It was for David and also for for Frank. Yeah, David first.
Yes, of course, putting things so black and white is like a, what's called the paranoid schizoid position of 3-month-old babies. Yes, I think it's probably not so black and white, right? And I think what I try to say is that that I think a world without arms is probably too utopian, and I do see that in some cases military force might be good. But when you look at what happened the last couple of decades, there's also a lot of, I would say propaganda about that most of the wars that we take part in are just wars and are good wars. And in hindsight, they are not. And sometimes already inside the reporters report that it's not. And so I think my middle position would be not to say, well, it's the way of the world and that's how it goes, but would be to say, try not to contribute too much to this disbalance in power, because I think if there's a strong military disbalance in power, why put your time into increasing that even further? Then it just seems that the political checks that we try are simply not enough to prevent, I think mistakes that shouldn't be made. So in that sense, black and white, it's all right what I do, it's all wrong. I think that's utopia. I think it's part and parcel of human existence to deal with the fact that things that we try to do good can turn up bad, and things that are bad, there might be beneficial effects from it too. And coming to peace with that, I think is part of our challenge as humans. Yeah. So I don't know if that helps, but certainly I don't think one of these two extreme stances is the right one or true.
Thank you, David. And I think this is a great question for Frank too. I think an NGO like yours is probably always trying to strike a good balance between idealism and realism. How do you do that?
I think that is indeed it, and maybe just a few short examples. David, you referred to that failed prohibition of the crossbow by a pope a long time ago. I think that is one of the areas that we've seen over the past few decades where civil society can make a difference when it's about disarmament and arms control. You may remember the international treaty to ban anti-personnel mines was very much driven by not only civil society as like the big organizations such as Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International, but also by a lot of organizations working with victims, survivors of these weapons. And also, of course, for example, Lady Diana, who was a very visible personality putting her weight behind that prohibition. And I think we could see that while initially it was what we heard from the states was, this is completely impossible, you will never change that. And it happened, it was possible. And what was it, 10 years later, the same for cluster munitions. And so it is a lesson that what also happened in my direct area of work, the arms trade. Everything is under control in trade treaties, but the arms trade had never been under any sort of trade treaty. It's not the solution. It's not a ban on the arms trade. It will maybe not even prevent all the harmful, controversial arms trade, but at least what we have now is a regulatory framework in which you can hold states accountable of arms transfers that they have endorsed, and have a legal discussion also about how that is allowed or not under the Arms Trade Treaty. So, just shortly, I believe that is especially where arms control advocates, be it humanitarian organizations, human rights organizations, peace organizations, have shown that they can work together with governments, first with progressive governments, but you will see, as happened with the landmines, even though the US and China and India and Israel and Pakistan have never signed it, it has stigmatized the use of anti-personnel landmines, and I think since the treaty is there, very little use by state parties, at least, has been made of it. So, yeah, that's a long answer to what was a short question. Sorry.
No, thank you very much, Christina. What time is it in Canberra?
You're muted.
I think you're muted. Someone had to do
Sorry,
that. No,
sorry,
there's no
it's
Zoom
really
meeting
late.
without that.
That's the answer. No, I'm in Brisbane and it's
Brisbane,
1:50 a.m.
1:50. Thank you. So kids are still sleeping.
Yes,
Okay,
they
so
are.
let's not talk too loud. But I have a last question from my side and then a final round of questions from the audience. The final question from my side for all of you is, so we live in an interesting time in many ways. The political, international political situation is different than many years ago. The technological development has changed very much. The relationship between big tech companies and politics has changed also. The last development of AI has sparked a lot of debates also on the military side. So do you think that this is a time in which is more difficult or less difficult to take an answer to the question we are answering today? Is there a more clear-cut answer today, or is a more nuanced answer today? I will start from you, Christina, compared to many years ago.
Ooh. Do you want a clear-cut answer on that question, or you want a nuance?
No, is it more difficult? Is it more difficult today to answer this question, or it's easier to answer this question today in the present day international scenario?
I believe there's two. I think we need more nuance because the technological world, like the environment, the makeup of the world in technological sense is changing. It's fluid, it's blurry, and the international makeup is shifting as well. Like nowadays, we're talking here in Australia. Yesterday there was an article in the newspaper. We can hear the war drums beat again in the distance. There's going to be, and we don't know anymore, like, what is our relationship with Israel? What is our relationship with the Middle East? I believe we need a really more nuanced approach. It's not as clear cut. The enemy is coming from the east. It's not the case anymore. I think we need maybe in what we call in academia an interdisciplinary approach to international problems. So that's my answer.
Thank you, Christina. Frank, and then I will let this time David be the last.
Yeah, difficult to look at, but briefly, I would think that it is as difficult as we make it, and it requires political commitment by states, and in that sense, maybe if you put it in the context of major world powers, I'm hopeful that under President Biden there will be a much more constructive approach between especially the three major powers, Russia, China, and the US, because I still do believe that for none of the three and none of the rest of the world, it's productive to have this confrontational approach. And I think it's also, it's important not to think in stereotypes in this sense. And
So we just need to wait for.
And then on a very different, if you look at technology and the role of engineers, And for example, looking at autonomous weapons and artificial intelligence, as we talked about, referred to a lot today, yes, this is very complicated, it won't be easy, but for example, when we were working on the chemical weapons convention, there was also the same sort of discussions that this is all difficult because it's dual use and you cannot ban chlorine. No, we did not ban chlorine, but we banned chlorine to use as a weapon of war. And we were able to set up a system that still allows all the commercial activity in the chemical industry, but that sets very clear standards for what is not allowed on the military side. And I think, even though it may be more difficult, something similar must be possible for the area of artificial intelligence, robotics, autonomous weapons.
So you think it's not a completely new challenge?
We can learn from past challenges, and again, I think if there's a will, there's a way.
Thank you. David, what has been the biggest change in the past 30 years, and how are things today more difficult from this point of view, as an engineer thinking about working with the military?
Right. So I think, first of all, I'm a postmodernist at heart. So, so I think it's just the world has become more in flux and interconnected, and in a way less black and white. So I think that makes it more difficult to operate as an engineer. The second element that I think makes it more complicated is I think Christina also mentioned this kind of need for interdisciplinary thinking. And so if everything is so incredibly frenetic and interconnected, that means, we can't solve just technical solutions or just, political problems or just, user interface problems. And I think that realization that that's the case actually requires something else from academics, where I think, you can't say, yeah, I don't want artificial intelligence to do anything bad, so I simply won't work on it, and then I'm all right or something. And so you probably need your domain knowledge and the ability and interest to work with other people to put it in context. And I think that realization, I think that's happening now in the last couple of years. That makes the field of an engineer more complicated and, in my opinion, much more exciting. And in that sense, I think it comes full circle to what happened after the Second World War and all the horrors that went along with that, which is actually when this, for example, these Maven meetings, the cybernetics meeting of Norbert Wiener started, who actually worked a lot on the military-industrial complex. And so he actually he honed his skills in the military world and then said, hey, wait a minute, actually, maybe that's not the solution. And he, in that sense, he kind of woke up, you could say, and start to see the connections. And so I think this circle is happening right now again, which what makes it very exciting. So autonomous systems are going to society in our personal world a lot, and that makes it deals with us, and we have to understand context and sociology and psychology, and it makes it very exciting, but very difficult for engineers.
Thank you.
Long answer, sorry. But
but
yeah.
it was a difficult question, I realize. So is there anybody who wants to share their thoughts on what they've learned, something that they, or just yet another question to any of our panelists? Yes, please. That's an interesting question for you, Christina. So the lady asks, if good engineers stop working for bad projects, for the military projects they think are not worth working with, don't we run the risk that bad engineers, or will do that? So after all, don't good engineers have a obligation to take any job in the military and to try to make it as good as it gets.
Yes, thank you for the question. I think you have really, it's again about striking a balance. Like during the war, there were two types of engineers: those that rejected to cooperate, to do anything, and those that said, "Let me do it before somebody else does a good job for the Nazis. Let me do and try my best, even though it's a lot of risk I'm taking. I will do it." So I think it's you can't say black or white, like this project they should take, that project they should not take. I think they just have to look very carefully. And also, like, I think the examples were there. If you can make a stance and try to convince people in the military that this is not a good way to go forward with a certain project, that you should go for that. And I think a very strong, nowadays, society does not tolerate when you make mistakes. Everything is transparent. So I believe this is a very good time to be critical, but not critical for the sake of being critical, but critical for the sake of advancing just societies.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Lipo, can I ask a question also?
Of course, good.
I want to know in the audience if anybody changed her or his mind.
Yeah. I was about to do that.
With the, oh, you were about to do it. Sorry,
sorry
for stealing the thunder.
No. Great minds think alike, and also small minds like ours. All right, indeed, it's 6 p.m. So I think it's about time to go. But before we go, let's do the final test. Can you please answer the question again? Should an engineer work for the military? Green is yes, and red is no. Interesting. I think it's someone is sort of a flipping state in the American elections. Is there anybody who has flipped? Because I didn't take count. There was someone flipping there. Only one, I believe. So most people stuck to their original opinion, which does not mean that they haven't learned anything, of course. But so, David, Christine, Frank, thank you very much for joining us in this conversation. A big applause for you. And thank you, Trish, and everybody for organizing this. I see that there is also a material reward for the lucky ones who are here.
You get the wine, I get the mic, thank you. And thank you so much. Both of you, we don't have digital wine, yes, unfortunately, but come and pick it up once you're in Holland. Yeah, okay.
I don't trust Filippo.
No, neither do I. But
how many witnesses do we have here? Take a picture, I want it.
Yeah, well, what's right or wrong? That's the question, isn't it? Hey, thank you very much for coming. I hope you enjoyed it. At least, I think we're all really excited that it worked out, even though we had to live stream and I don't know what. I think everyone did a really great job. So this will be a monthly event. Next time, it's about autonomy, moral decision-making, and technology. For instance, self-driving cars, what if they make the decision to, I don't know, ride you into the canal or something because someone else is on the zebra path. Or if they want to save your life and you kill someone else with a self-driving car, whatever. Those kind of questions. So can they make moral decisions? I hope you're really looking forward to that, and tell everyone that tonight was absolutely fantastic and everyone needs to join you, yeah? Keep an eye on the Studium Generale website. And hope to see you next month then. Thank you.